Peleliu, September 1944. A Marine rifle company goes over a ridgeline with 41 men and 2 officers. It comes back with 33 men and no officers. Both lieutenants are dead. The gunnery sergeant who takes command has never led more than a squad. He has no radio, no map of what is on the other side of the next ridge, and no way to reach battalion except by sending a runner who may not come back. He looks at his 33 men. He gives an order. They go forward. The Japanese regimental commander, watching from a fortified cave on the ridge above, writes in his diary that evening that he does not understand what he is fighting. His training told him that a unit which loses its officers loses its ability to function as a unit, that it will fragment, fall back, seek cover, wait for someone to tell it what to do. Instead, the leaderless Marines below him reorganized in less than 4 minutes and resumed the assault. He writes that they do not behave like soldiers. He writes that they behave like something else entirely. He does not have a word for what he is watching because his military culture has not produced a concept for it. This is no man's land. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. New documentaries drop every single week. The confusion of Japanese commanders when Marine units continued functioning after catastrophic officer casualties was not a failure of observation. It was the product of a fundamentally different theory of military organization that Japanese doctrine had spent decades building and that the Pacific War was dismantling in real time. Imperial Japanese Army and Navy doctrine placed the officer at the absolute center of unit cohesion. The officer was not simply the man who gave orders. He was the embodiment of the Emperor's will within the unit, the spiritual and tactical authority without which the unit had no legitimate reason to act. Enlisted men in the Imperial Japanese military were trained to execute orders, not to generate them. Initiative below the officer level was not cultivated, and in many cases was actively discouraged, because unsanctioned action represented a kind of insubordination regardless of its tactical result. The practical consequence was visible in engagement after engagement across the Pacific. Japanese units that lost their officers in the early phases of a battle frequently became tactically inert, holding defensive positions but unable to maneuver, waiting for replacement officers who might not come, or reverting to the banzai charge as the only form of offensive action that required no tactical coordination and therefore no officer to plan it. Japanese military planners had designed this centralization deliberately. The Meiji-era army that modernized Japan's military in the late 19th century borrowed heavily from German and Prussian doctrine, which also emphasized strong officer control, but then pushed that centralization further through the lens of Bushido and the Emperor's divine authority. By the time the Pacific War began, the concentration of decision-making authority at the officer level was not just doctrine, it was cultural theology. And when that theology met the Marine Corps institutional structure on the coral atolls and volcanic islands of the Pacific, it produced a confusion that Japanese commanders could observe in detail but could not resolve, no matter how many battles they analyzed or how many after-action reports they wrote. The Marine Corps that fought from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima was built on an institutional foundation that Japanese military culture had not replicated. The non-commissioned officer corps, the gunnery sergeants, staff sergeants, and sergeants who formed the intermediate layer between commissioned officers and the privates below them. In the Japanese military, the non-commissioned officer existed primarily as a disciplinary instrument. He enforced the officer's orders, maintained physical standards, and punished infractions. He was not trained to replace the officer in a tactical emergency, because the doctrine did not contemplate a situation in which that replacement would be necessary as a planned capability rather than a desperate improvisation with no institutional grounding. The Marine Corps NCO occupied a completely different institutional role. He was trained to lead independently, not to assist the officer in leading, but to lead on his own authority when circumstances required it. The curriculum at Marine NCO schools covered terrain analysis, fire and maneuver, coordination with supporting arms, and the communication of tactical orders to subordinates under fire. These were not skills reserved for officers. They were the expected competencies of a sergeant, tested against realistic standards before promotion. A Marine gunnery sergeant, who had completed that curriculum and spent years applying it in training and combat, was not waiting for an officer to tell him what to do. He was a man the institution had specifically prepared for the moment the officer went down, because the institution had decided that that moment was not an exception to be weathered, but a condition to be planned for as a normal feature of small unit combat. The difference in what the two institutions built into the men who filled those roles explains more about the disparity in outcomes across the Pacific Island campaigns than any comparison of weapons, numbers, or individual courage. The gap between Japanese doctrine and Marine reality became most visible not in major set-piece battles, but in the small engagements that made up the texture of fighting on every island. A Marine rifle squad in 1944 consisted of 13 men led by a sergeant. When that sergeant was killed, a corporal took over. When the corporal went down, a private first class with demonstrated competence stepped up. This chain of succession was built into the training, rehearsed in field exercises, and understood by every man in the squad as a standing institutional expectation rather than an emergency improvisation invented under pressure. The Japanese officers who observed these successions in real time, who watched a Marine unit lose its leadership and reconstitute at the next tier down without breaking stride, recorded their observations with professional bewilderment. One Japanese battalion commander on Saipan described in a post-war interview watching a Marine platoon lose its lieutenant to a sniper at the moment of a coordinated assault. The platoon sergeant immediately reorganized the attack, adjusted the axis of advance to account for a Japanese machine gun position the lieutenant had not known about, and completed the assault approximately 2 minutes slower than the original plan. The battalion commander said that in his experience, a Japanese platoon losing its lieutenant in the first 30 seconds of an assault would not have completed that assault at all. What he was describing was not a difference in individual courage between the two forces. He was describing a structural difference in how authority was distributed and how the loss of authority at one tier triggered an automatic response at the tier below. A response that had been rehearsed until it was institutional reflex rather than conscious decision. That reflex, multiplied across every squad and platoon in every rifle company on every island in the Pacific, is what Japanese commanders were watching and could not name. The Marine Corps institutional culture that produced this capability was the accumulated product of decades of deliberate design, tracing back to the small wars of the early 20th century. In Nicaragua, Haiti, and Santo Domingo, Marine units had frequently found themselves operating where there were no senior officers to provide direction, and where the junior NCO or even the senior private was the highest-ranking American within miles. Those campaigns burned a specific lesson into the institutional memory of the Corps. Combat does not distribute itself evenly across rank. The lieutenant gets shot. The captain gets wounded. The major is at battalion headquarters when the situation at the front changes faster than communications can carry information. The man on the ground with the rifle is frequently the man who has to make the decision. And if that man has not been trained to make the decision does not get made. The training pipeline that Marine recruits moved through at Parris Island and San Diego was built around this recognition at every level. Physical training was partly about fitness and partly about demonstrating to recruits that their limits were further away than they believed. The tactical curriculum that followed was built explicitly around scenarios in which the designated leader became a casualty and the next man had to take over without hesitation or authorization from above. New recruits who had never thought of themselves as leaders discovered during training that the Marine Corps had decided they were leaders whether they felt ready or not, and that the institutional expectation of leadership at every level was backed by a training system designed to produce the competence that expectation demanded, rather than simply announcing the expectation and hoping the competence would follow. By the time a Marine reached a rifle company in the Pacific, the succession assumption was as natural as the assumption that the sun would rise, and it worked in practice for the same reason it worked in theory. The institution had built it into every man rather than leaving it as a contingency to be handled by whoever happened to be standing when the contingency arrived. The casualty rates among Marine officers in the Pacific Island campaigns were extraordinarily high by any historical standard, and the fact that those rates did not produce corresponding collapses in unit effectiveness is precisely what makes the Marine Corps institutional resilience worth examining in detail. On Tarawa, Marine assault battalions lost their commanding officers at rates that would have been considered operationally catastrophic under most military doctrines. On Peleliu, entire companies fought for days under Staff Sergeant command because every commissioned officer had been killed or evacuated. On Iwo Jima, the intensity of Japanese defensive fire produced officer casualties so severe in the first days that regiment-level commanders were in direct radio contact with sergeant-led platoons because no one between them and the sergeants was still alive to relay orders. The Japanese defensive system on these islands had been deliberately designed to maximize officer casualties in the opening assault phases. Kuribayashi on Iwo Jima and his counterpart on Peleliu both understood that destroying the American officer corps in the first hours was the fastest route to operational paralysis. Japanese snipers were trained to identify and prioritize officers as targets. Pre-registered artillery concentrations were placed on terrain where officers would naturally gather to coordinate. The defensive architecture directed the heaviest fire toward the areas where command and control activity would concentrate. The design was tactically coherent and executed with precision. The officer casualties were real, severe, and exactly what the Japanese defensive planners had intended to produce. The unit paralysis that was supposed to follow those casualties was the part of the design that the Marine Corps institutional structure had made obsolete before the first Marines stepped off a landing craft. The engagement on Peleliu's ridges in September and October of 1944 provides the clearest extended case study of Marine units operating under sustained officer attrition over a prolonged period. The Brogol, which Marines called Bloody Nose Ridge, was a coral limestone formation containing 500 interconnected caves from which Japanese defenders engaged attacking Marines from multiple directions simultaneously, then withdrew through the cave network to avoid American fire. Taking the ridge required repeated assaults against fortified positions in terrain that channeled attackers into killing grounds without cover. 1st Marine Regiment bore the primary burden of the Brogol assault in the first week of the battle and suffered officer casualties so severe that by the 5th day, 3 of its 4 rifle companies were being commanded by NCOs. The regiment was so damaged it had to be relieved and replaced by Army units. What the after-action reports document about those 5 days is not a unit in progressive disintegration, but a unit in sustained functional operation under conditions that should have produced organizational collapse, according to any conventional doctrine. Squads that lost their squad leaders continued to assault. Platoons that lost both their lieutenant and their platoon sergeant reorganized around the most experienced corporal available and maintained tactical coherence. Companies that lost their captains and first lieutenants operated under Staff Sergeant command and continued to coordinate with adjacent units, call for fire support from artillery and naval gunfire, evacuate their wounded through the same terrain they were fighting through, and report their positions accurately to battalion through a communication chain that kept functioning, because the people responsible for maintaining it kept getting replaced by the next man down, rather than leaving a gap that nobody filled. The Japanese military conducted formal after-action analysis of the Pacific Island battles, and the documents that survived the war and were translated by American military historians contain passages that illuminate with unusual directness how Japanese commanders processed the evidence of Marine resilience under officer casualties. A report from the Japanese 32nd Army on Okinawa, prepared after the battle and recovered intact from a storage cave, contains a section on American infantry tactics that addresses the officer casualty problem explicitly. The report's author, a senior staff officer who had studied the Iwo Jima battle and observed the Okinawa battle directly, wrote that American infantry units demonstrated an unusual capacity for self-organization at the small unit level that Japanese forces could not replicate. He attributed this capacity specifically to the American practice of distributing tactical authority downward to the non-commissioned officer level in a way that Japanese doctrine did not permit and Japanese training did not develop. He recommended in the report's final section that the Imperial Japanese Army consider a fundamental restructuring of NCO training to incorporate the independent tactical decision-making authority that American NCOs appeared to possess as an institutional standard. rather than an individual exception. The structural honesty of that recommendation, a senior Japanese officer formally acknowledging in a military document that American NCO capability was superior to Japanese NCO capability and recommending specific institutional changes to address the gap, is remarkable given the cultural pressures within the Japanese military against admitting any form of inferiority to an opponent. The fact that the recommendation was written at all suggests that the evidence from the island battles had become too consistent and too overwhelming to be explained away through any other analysis, and that at least some Japanese officers had moved past the instinct to attribute Marine resilience to individual courage or racial characteristics, and had recognized it as an institutional output that their own institution had not produced. Behind the institutional analysis are the specific men whose decisions in specific moments made the Marine Corps' theoretical resilience into a practical reality. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone on Guadalcanal held his section's defensive position through a night assault by a Japanese regiment after the officer responsible for his area could not coordinate the response, working his machine guns manually for hours when the weapons jammed from continuous fire, keeping his men in position under conditions that had already killed most of the Marines around him, and doing it not through any inspiration that came to him in the moment, but through training and institutional expectation that told him his job was to hold his position, regardless of what happened to everyone above him in the chain of command. The staff sergeant on Peleliu, who looked at his 8 surviving men after the platoon sergeant and both lieutenants had been evacuated, assessed the Japanese position his unit was supposed to take, concluded that the original approach was no longer viable given his reduced strength, identified an alternative route through dead ground that the Japanese had not covered, led his 8 men through it, and took the position from a direction the defenders had not expected. He did this not because he improvised brilliantly under pressure, but because the Marine Corps had trained him to make exactly that kind of assessment and act on it without waiting for authorization from above. The corporal on Iwo Jima, who reorganized the survivors of his squad after a mortar round, killed his sergeant, distributed ammunition from the dead, assigned fields of fire to the living, and reported his position and strength to the platoon sergeant 200 yards away so that the platoon sergeant could incorporate his squad into the broader defensive plan. He was 19 years old. The Marine Corps had built him to be ready. The Japanese commanders who watched Marine units reconstitute after officer casualties could observe the outcome, but could not diagnose the cause because the cause was institutional and invisible from the other side of a minefield or a ridgeline. You cannot see a training pipeline from a fortified cave. You cannot observe the accumulated effect of years of NCO schools and field exercises and small unit leadership doctrine from the other side of a coral reef. What Japanese commanders could see was the output, the unit that kept moving, the assault that did not stall, the Marines who were still advancing the morning after losses that should have broken them. But the mechanism that produced that output was embedded in an institution that Japanese military culture had built along different principles and could not reform in the time available even after identifying the problem. The after-action reports that recommended restructuring Japanese NCO training were written by men who understood what they were observing. The problem was that understanding what you are observing and having the institutional capacity to change what you have built are separated by years of cultural investment, training infrastructure, and command culture that no theater commander could reform with a recommendation in a document. The Marines who kept fighting after losing half their officers were not extraordinary men in any statistical sense. They were ordinary men who had been trained by an extraordinary institution, one that had looked at the realities of small unit combat, accepted that officers die and that units must function after they die, and built its training system around that acceptance at every level from recruit depot through NCO school through field exercises, through the expectations that every man in a rifle squad carried with him into combat. The Japanese commanders who could not explain it were not failing to see clearly. They were seeing clearly and not having a framework to explain what they saw because their institution had not built one. A Japanese regimental commander on Peleliu wrote in his diary that the Marines did not behave like soldiers. He was correct in the specific sense he meant. They did not behave like Japanese soldiers, whose doctrine concentrated authority at the officer level and whose training did not prepare the men below the officer to act when the officer was gone. They behaved like Marines, whose doctrine distributed authority downward through deliberate institutional design and whose training built the expectation that the next man would step up as a reflexive institutional response rather than an act of individual heroism. That difference, invisible from a ridge, was the difference between a military culture that produced paralysis when officers died and one that produced the next leader from whoever was still standing. If this video meant something to you, hit the like button right now. It is the single best way to push this story to someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you are not already here. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and whether anyone in your family served in the Pacific or the Marine Corps. We will see you in the next one.